It started with a knock at my door
It
that
is?
didn't sound friendly. The kind of sharp, impatient pounding that instantly makes your stomach
It
tighten.
is?
I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment I just stood there, listening, hoping whoever it was might realize they had the wrong house and leave. The knocking didn't stop.
Need
In fact, it got louder, more aggressive,
I can't
like the
deal
person
with
on
this
the other side
anymore.
felt entitled
We've
to
got
my
to address
attention.
the parking
I
situation
took a breath,
before it gets out
reminded
of hand.
myself
It's
that I
affecting
was on my
everyone
own
here.
property, and opened the door. Standing there was a middle-aged woman with a stiff posture, crossed arms, and a look on her face that said she'd already decided I was the problem. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't say hello. Instead, she glanced past me, scanning my driveway like an inspector searching for violations. Before I could speak, she pointed behind me and said, "You can park that there." Her tone wasn't a request or even a complaint. It was a command, like she was used to people immediately obeying her. I was confused. My car was parked in my own driveway, perfectly within the lines, not blocking the sidewalk, not bothering anyone. I calmly told her that this was my house and that I'd been parking there for years without an issue. That's when she straightened up even more, as if I'd challenged her authority. "This is an HOA neighborhood," she said, emphasizing the letters like they were some kind of legal spell. "And I am on the board." That was my first clue that this wasn't going to be a normal conversation. I'd lived here long enough to know the rules, and I was well aware that my driveway was private property. I politely asked her which rule I was violating. Instead of answering, she scoffed and told me she didn't need to explain herself to me. According to her, my car looked out of place, and neighbors had complained. When I asked which neighbors, she waved her hand vaguely, as if that detail didn't matter. At this point, I was still calm, but I could feel the tension building. She kept shifting her weight, tapping her foot, clearly frustrated that I wasn't backing down. I explained, again, that I wasn't breaking any HOA rules and that if there was a concern, she could send me something in writing. That's when her face changed. The tight smile disappeared, replaced by a look of irritation that bordered on anger. She leaned in slightly and lowered her voice, like she was about to drop a threat. "If you don't move that car right now," she said, "I'll call the police." For a second, I honestly thought she was bluffing. Calling the police over a car parked in its own driveway sounded ridiculous. I even laughed a little, thinking maybe she'd realize how extreme she was being. She didn't laugh back. Instead, she pulled her phone out of her pocket and held it up, as if to show me she was serious. There was a strange confidence in her eyes, like she'd done this before and expected it to work. I told her she was free to call whoever she wanted, but I wasn't moving my car. That only seemed to fuel her sense of superiority. She stepped back, started dialing, and loudly announced that she was calling the police because there was a disturbance, and someone was refusing to comply with HOA regulations. I could hear her exaggerating every word, painting me as some kind of troublemaker in my own driveway. As she talked, a couple of neighbors slowed down to watch. One stopped while walking his dog, pretending not to stare but clearly listening. Another peeked out from behind her curtains. The situation was turning into a small neighborhood spectacle. Exactly what she wanted. She kept glancing at me while she spoke into the phone, smirking like she'd already won. While she was on the call, I stood there thinking about how absurd the whole thing was. I wasn't yelling. I wasn't threatening her. I wasn't breaking any rules. Yet here I was, about to have the police show up because someone with a little HOA power decided she didn't like how my driveway looked. The more I thought about it, the more confident I became that this was going to backfire on her. She finished the call and told me the police were on their way. "You should have just listened," she said, shaking her head as if I were a child who'd made a bad decision. I calmly told her I'd be happy to explain the situation to the officers. That answer seemed to annoy her even more, because she was clearly expecting fear or panic, not calm cooperation. We stood there in awkward silence for a few minutes. She stayed planted on the sidewalk, arms crossed again, watching my house like she was guarding a crime scene. I stayed by my door, making sure not to give her any reaction she could twist against me. Every now and then, She muttered something about rules and entitled people, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. As the sound of distant sirens finally approached, I could tell she was pleased. She adjusted her posture, smoothed her hair, and took on that confident stance again. The one that said she was in charge and justice was about to be served. What she didn't know, and what made the whole situation almost surreal, was that she had no idea how wrong she was about to be. That knock on my door, meant to intimidate me into submission, had set off a chain of events that would turn her little power trip into an epic backfire. She said it so casually, like she was talking about the weather. "I am calling the police." The words rolled off her tongue with a smug little smile, the kind that suggested she expected instant obedience. There was something unsettling about how confident she sounded, as if the simple act of dialing a number would immediately put me in my place. She didn't hesitate or ask again. In her mind, the decision was already made, and she wanted me to feel the weight of it. I looked at her for a moment, trying to understand how a disagreement over a parked car had escalated to this point. She was standing there on the sidewalk, phone in hand, shoulders squared, clearly enjoying the attention she was about to get. I asked her, calmly, why she thought the police were necessary. That only seemed to irritate her. She rolled her eyes and told me that people like me never listened unless law enforcement was involved.
I can't deal with this anymore.
The way she said it was dismissive,
We've got to address
like she'd
the
already
parking
written me off
situation
as
before it
some
gets
kind
out
of problem
hand.
resident.
It's affecting everyone
As she
here.
began tapping on her phone, she started narrating her actions out loud. "I've already warned you," she said, raising her voice just enough so nearby houses could hear. "You were refusing to comply." It felt like she was building a case in real time, making sure anyone within earshot would assume I was in the wrong. I tried once more to explain that I wasn't violating any rules, but she talked over me, waving her hand as if my words were irrelevant. When she finally got someone on the line, her tone shifted instantly. The irritation vanished, replaced by a concerned, almost shaky voice. She described the situation as if she were the victim of some ongoing disturbance. According to her, I was being aggressive, uncooperative, and disrespectful. I stood there listening, stunned by how easily she twisted the facts. She even took a few steps back, glancing at me like she was afraid, clearly putting on a performance for the person on the other end of the call. The more she talked, the more I realized she was counting on one thing: intimidation. She wanted me to panic, to apologize, to move my car just to make the situation go away. But that's not how it felt on my end. Instead of fear, I felt a strange sense of calm. I knew I hadn't done anything wrong, and her overreaction only made that clearer. I decided then that I wasn't going to engage any further. I crossed my arms and waited, letting her finish her dramatic explanation. As she hung up, she let out a small sigh of satisfaction. "They're on their way," she announced, like she just delivered a verdict. Then she smiled again, that same confident smile, and added, "Maybe next time you'll think twice before breaking the rules." I told her, evenly, that I was looking forward to clearing everything up. That response seemed to catch her off guard. She hesitated for a second, then shrugged it off, assuming I was bluffing. A few minutes passed, and the atmosphere grew heavier. She stayed right where she was, planted on the sidewalk, occasionally checking her phone and glancing at my driveway. I noticed more neighbors starting to watch. A garage door across the street slowly opened, then stopped halfway, as if the person inside wanted a better view. Someone else stood on their porch pretending to scroll through their phone. The whole block felt like it was holding its breath. She took advantage of the audience, loud enough for everyone to hear. She started talking about how some residents just don't respect community standards, and how difficult it was to keep the neighborhood orderly. Every sentence was designed to paint herself as the responsible authority figure and me as the careless rule breaker. I didn't respond. I could tell that my silence bothered her. Without an argument to feed off, she kept repeating herself, growing more frustrated with each passing minute. At one point, she looked directly at me and said, "You know, if you had just apologized, this wouldn't have gone this far." There was an edge to her voice now, a hint of doubt creeping in. I replied that apologizing for something I didn't do didn't make sense. That seemed to strike a nerve. Her jaw tightened, and she turned away, muttering under her breath about how people never take responsibility. As the sound of sirens grew closer, her demeanor shifted again. She straightened her back, smoothed her clothes, and took on that authoritative posture once more. It was almost rehearsed, like she'd played this role before. She positioned herself slightly in front of me, as if she wanted to be the first person the officers saw. The confidence was back, but now it felt forced, like she was trying to convince herself just as much as she was trying to convince everyone else. Standing there, waiting for the police to arrive, I couldn't help but think about how unnecessary all of this was. A simple conversation could have ended it. Instead, she chose an escalation, relying on fear and authority to get her way. What she didn't realize was that every exaggerated claim, every dramatic gesture, was only setting the stage for what was about to happen. When the police finally turned onto our street, she smiled again, certain that this was the moment she'd been waiting for. She had no idea that calling them wasn't going to end the way she expected. The police cars pulled up slower than I expected, rolling down the street like they were in no rush at all. The flashing lights reflected off the parked cars and nearby windows, instantly drawing even more attention. A few neighbors who had been pretending not to watch now made no effort to hide it. This was officially a scene. I stayed where I was, hands visible, calm, while she stepped forward eagerly, practically ready to greet them like honored guests. 2 officers got out of the car, scanning the area before approaching. Before either of them could even speak, she jumped in, launching into her version of events with dramatic urgency. She pointed at my driveway, then at me, explaining how she had repeatedly warned me and how I was being non-compliant and hostile. She talked fast, layering accusation after accusation, clearly trying to overwhelm the situation before I could say a word. One officer nodded politely while the other listened quietly, his expression neutral. When she finally paused to catch her breath, one of the officers raised a hand gently and said, "Ma'am, we'll hear from him in a moment." That alone seemed to irritate her. She took a step back but stayed close, arms crossed, eyes locked on me. I explained calmly that my car was parked in my own driveway and that I wasn't aware of any rule I was violating. I told them I'd asked her to provide the specific HOA regulation in question, but she'd chosen to call the police instead. The officers exchanged a quick glance. One of them asked her which rule was being broken. She hesitated, just for a second, then said something vague about unauthorized vehicles and community standards. The officer nodded slowly and followed up with a simple question that changed the entire tone of the situation. "Is the driveway private property?" he asked. She answered quickly, "Well, yes, but nothing," the officer said, still calm. "If it's private property and the vehicle belongs to the homeowner, that's not a police matter." The words hung in the air. I saw her confidence flicker for the first time. She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again, clearly searching for something else to say. The second officer asked if there had been any threats, physical contact, or actual disturbance. She shook her head, then tried to recover by saying she felt intimidated. The officer looked at me, then back at her, and asked what specifically I'd done that was intimidating. She gestured vaguely, saying I was refusing to listen. That didn't seem to impress them. One officer walked over to my driveway, glanced at the car, and then back at me. "This is your vehicle?" he asked. I confirmed it was. "And this is your residence?" Again, I said yes. He nodded and turned back to her. "Then there's no violation here." At that point, the shift was obvious. Her posture stiffened, and the smug expression she'd been wearing slowly dissolved. She tried one last angle, insisting that HOA rules carried legal weight and that the police were required to enforce them. The officer shook his head. "HOA rules are civil matters," he explained. "We don't enforce them unless there's a court order or an actual crime." That explanation didn't sit well with her at all. She crossed her arms tighter and said the HOA president would hear about this. The officer remained unfazed. Then he asked another question, one that clearly caught her off guard. "Why did you tell dispatch there was a disturbance?" He asked. From what we were seeing, there isn't one. Her face flushed. She stumbled through an explanation, saying she felt uncomfortable and didn't know what else to do. The officer's tone became firmer. He reminded her that calling the police under false pretenses was a serious matter and that emergency services weren't meant to be used to settle neighborhood disputes. The neighbors watching went completely silent. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. The situation was unraveling on its own. The officers turned back to me and asked if I wanted to file a complaint about harassment. I was surprised by the question, but her reaction said everything. Her eyes widened, and she immediately started shaking her head, insisting it was all a misunderstanding. One officer told her that continuing to harass residents over non-issues could lead to real consequences. He suggested she take any concerns up through proper HOA channels instead of involving law enforcement. She nodded stiffly, clearly humiliated, while trying to save face in front of the audience she decreated. Finally, the officers addressed both of us together. They made it clear that no laws had been broken and that the matter was closed. They warned against wasting police resources and encouraged everyone to resolve future disagreements civilly. With that, they headed back to their car. As they drove away, the crowd slowly dispersed. Garage doors closed. Curtains fell back into place. The street returned to normal. She stood there for a moment, staring at the ground, then muttered something under her breath and walked off without another word. I went back inside, heart still racing but with a sense of quiet satisfaction. That one simple question about private property had completely flipped the script. What she thought would be a show of authority had turned into a public reminder of her limits. And it was clear that the night wasn't over yet. The fallout from that moment was only just beginning. The moment the officers made it clear they weren't on her side, everything she'd been standing on started to crumble. You could almost see it happening in real time. The confident stance, the tight smile, the authority she'd been projecting all evening had all faded, replaced by visible frustration. She tried to regain control of the situation by leaning harder into the HOA angle, repeating the words, rules, and violations, like a broken record, hoping one of them would magically stick. She pulled out her phone again, scrolling furiously, insisting she had proof. According to her, the HOA handbook clearly stated that certain vehicles weren't allowed to be parked in driveways. One of the officers asked her to show the exact rule. She hesitated, then handed over her phone with a forced smile, saying it was right here somewhere. The officer patiently scrolled while she hovered nearby, nervously explaining each line before he even finished reading it. After a moment, he handed the phone back. This section is about commercial vehicles, he said, and even then, it specifies overnight street parking, not private driveways. That was it. That single clarification shattered her argument completely. She opened her mouth to protest, but no sound came out. Her face tightened, and she looked around, suddenly aware of the neighbors still watching from a distance. She tried pivoting again, saying that the HOA had the right to fine residents for noncompliance. The officer nodded and calmly explained that fines were handled internally through HOA procedures, not through police intervention. That's a civil issue, he repeated, not criminals. Each time he said it, her shoulders sank a little lower. What made it worse for her was that the officers weren't rude or aggressive. They were professional, calm, and clear, which made it impossible for her to play the victim. There was no shouting, no chaos, just facts. And facts were not on her side. She had expected backup, authority, and validation. Instead, she was getting a quiet lesson in limits. I can't deal with this anymore. One of the officers reminded her that repeatedly confronting residents could be considered harassment, especially if there was no legitimate violation. He said it matter-of-factly, not as a threat, but as information. Still, the word harassment hit hard. Her eyes widened slightly. She immediately started backpedaling, insisting she was just doing her job as an HOA board member. That explanation didn't help her case. The officer responded that HOA board members were not law enforcement and had no special authority over residents beyond the established civil process. If she had concerns, She was advised to send written notices, follow due process, or bring it up at an HOA meeting. Showing up at someone else's house and calling the police is not appropriate. He added. The silence it followed was uncomfortable. Even the neighbors seemed to sense that the balance of power had shifted. A few of them nodded subtly, like they'd been waiting for someone to finally say out loud what they'd all been thinking for years. This wasn't about rules. It was about control. She stood there, arms crossed again, but this time it wasn't confident. It was defensive. She muttered that she was only trying to keep standards high. One officer responded evenly. Standards don't override the law. That sentence landed harder than anything else said that night. When the officers asked if there had been any prior issues between us, she quickly answered no, but her tone lacked conviction now. The officer glanced at me and asked the same question. I said there hadn't been any problems until tonight. That simple statement seemed to seal it. There was nothing more for them to investigate. Before leaving, one of the officers gave her a clear warning. He explained that using emergency services as a scare tactic could result in consequences if it happened again. He suggested she take a step back and reconsider how she handled conflicts in the future. She nodded stiffly, lips pressed together, clearly unhappy but unable to argue. As the officers turned to leave, she attempted one last save, saying she'd be reporting this incident to the HOA. The officer replied, "That's you're right," and then added, "Just make sure the report is accurate." That was the final blow. Accuracy had not been her strong point that evening. The police cars drove off, and the street slowly returned to its usual quiet. But the damage was done. Her authority, at least in that moment, was gone. She avoided eye contact with everyone around her, clearly aware that the audience she'd tried to impress had witnessed her public defeat. She lingered for a moment, as if unsure what to do next. Then she straightened her jacket, muttered something about wasting time, and walked away briskly, heels clicking against the sidewalk. No apology, no acknowledgement, just retreat. I stood there for a second, taking it all in. What started as a simple knock on my door had turned into a full exposure of how fragile her power really was. The rules she'd tried to weaponize against me had collapsed under the smallest amount of scrutiny. The authority she'd assumed she had vanished the moment it was tested. As I went back inside, I realized something important. This wasn't just a personal win. It was a reminder that intimidation only works when people are afraid to question it. The second someone calmly asks for facts, clarity, and boundaries, the whole act falls apart. And for her, that realization was probably far more painful than any fine or warning could ever be. By the end of the night, it was painfully clear that the only person who had truly gotten herself into trouble was the same one who had started it all. What began as an attempt to flex authority and intimidate me into submission had unraveled into something far more uncomfortable for her. The confidence she'd carried at the start of the confrontation was gone, replaced by an awkward silence and hurried footsteps as she disappeared down the sidewalk. The street felt different after that, like everyone had just witnessed a truth that had been quietly ignored for a long time. As the police left and the neighbors retreated back into their homes, I stayed outside for a moment, letting the adrenaline wear off. My heart was still racing, but now it was mixed with a sense of relief. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't insulted her. I hadn't done anything that could be twisted against me. And yet, she'd managed to expose herself simply by pushing too far. That realization settled in slowly, and the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that her actions had consequences far beyond that single evening. Over the next few days, the fallout became impossible to ignore. Neighbors who had previously kept their distance started greeting me more openly. One stopped to say he'd seen the whole thing and couldn't believe how she'd acted. Another mentioned, quietly, that she'd done similar things before, showing up unannounced and threatening fines or police calls over minor issues. What surprised me wasn't just the stories themselves, but the tone in which they were shared. There was a sense of validation, like people finally felt comfortable saying out loud what they'd been thinking for years. Word travels fast in neighborhoods, especially when authority figures stumble publicly. It wasn't too long before I heard that the HOA board had been flooded with complaints. Residents questioned why police had been called over a parked car and whether that kind of behavior represented them as a community. The same rules she tried to use as a weapon were now being examined under a microscope. Suddenly, it wasn't about my driveway anymore. It was about her judgment. She didn't knock on my door again. In fact, she went out of her way to avoid me. When we crossed paths, she looked away, pretending to be engrossed in her phone or suddenly very interested in the sky. The woman who once stood on the sidewalk with crossed arms and absolute certainty now couldn't even make eye contact. That shift said more than any apology ever could. There were rumors that she'd been formally warned by the HOA president about her conduct. Nothing dramatic, nothing public, but enough to make it clear that her approach wasn't acceptable. Whether that was true or not, the change in her behavior was undeniable. The sudden absence of her rule enforcement patrols spoke volumes. No more confrontations, no more threats, just quiet compliance with the limits she'd previously ignored. For me, the experience changed how I viewed power in everyday situations. She'd relied on fear, assuming that the mention of police would automatically make me back down. But when that fear didn't work, everything else collapsed. The system she thought she controlled turned out to have boundaries she couldn't cross. And those boundaries weren't enforced by shouting or intimidation, but by calm, clear facts. I also realized how important it was to stay composed. If I reacted emotionally, raised my voice, or insulted her, the narrative might have shifted. She could have pointed to my behavior as justification for her actions. Instead, her own exaggerations and misuse of authority became the focus. Sometimes, the most effective response isn't confrontation, but quiet confidence. The night itself faded into memory, but the lesson stuck. Authority without accountability is fragile. It depends entirely on people not questioning it. The moment someone does, especially in a calm and informed way, it starts to crack. She learned that lesson the hard way, in front of an audience she never intended to have. Looking back, I don't feel anger toward her. If anything, I feel a strange sense of clarity. She wasn't powerful. She was just loud. And when loudness met reality, reality won. The epic backfire wasn't just that the police didn't side with her. It was that her attempt to control the situation ended up stripping her of the very influence she thought she had. That night ended quietly for me. I went back inside, locked the door, and finally relaxed. But for her, the consequences lingered. Every avoided glance, every whispered complaint, every rule she no longer enforced was a reminder of that moment on the sidewalk. The moment when calling the police didn't make her stronger, but instead showed everyone exactly where her power ended. In the end, the story wasn't about winning or losing an argument. It was about accountability. She tried to use authority as a shortcut to control, and it backfired in the most public way possible. And as the neighborhood settled back into its routine, one thing was clear. The next time she thought about making that kind of call, she'd remember exactly how this one ended.